Oh, Zcee. Please don't mind the wall. I needed to come out for a break and a snack. Why are you looking at me like that? Is it because I'm a rat? Or because I entered your walls without consent? I'm just kidding. Though it is a funny thing that I recently happened to dig up this story from a delusion, describing the uses and consequences of fear which takes place in the distant planescape of Warhammer 40K, where your humankind still exists under the Imperium of Man. The most brutal and oppressive regime imaginable for your species, and yet, given the setting it resides in, validated and justified by its surroundings. You could say that fear is one of the main pillars that underpins the setting of 40K, but that is far too broad a topic for this chance meeting of ours. So, if you'd indulge me, I'd like to elucidate on how fear permeates through the Imperium and what that entails for its poor inhabitants. Existing as a human in the Imperium, regardless of where in it you are, is predicated on the hatred of the traitor, the heretic, the mutant, the witch, and of course, the alien. Rightfully earned from the countless and continuous machinations of said groups to destroy humanity as it is, as well as rigorously enforced by the various factions at the Imperium's head, chief among which, in terms of being present in the average citizen's day-to-day life, is the Adeptus Ministorum, or the Ecclesiarchy. Through them, the citizenry learn to fear the judgment of their lives by the God Emperor, and, if they do, he will protect them from the horrors of the galaxy. For quite a few worlds' populations, that would be just enough to keep them in line. Alas, a basic threat from a nebulous deity, and even more nebulous galactic threats that you will only really encounter in stories from people in significantly better situations than you, is not truly sufficient to supersede the duresses of life. Hunger, thirst, general safety from the surrounding population, all of which is without mentioning if you are in the waking nightmare that is living in a hive city. What is a hive city, you ask? The word superstructure pales in comparison. A man-made mountain whose base can span a country, whose buildings spire into the clouds, who is veined by countless kilometers of roadways that carry the blood of people and material from its highest peaks all the way down to the supporting depths that stretch as widely and deeply as the above hive itself, essentially creating two worlds capable of housing up to dozens to hundreds of billions of humans stacked on top of each other, mashed into a claustrophobic chokehold of overpopulation and misery. In a hive city, the aforementioned troubles are magnified 100-fold due to the suffocating number of people stacked as closely as possible in order to maximize the volume of productive cogs in the churning machine that is the Imperium, adding to the breathtaking pollution, regurgitated corpses and fluids, and being forever stuck in what is little better than a box. You have the myriad of hazards stemming from working back-breaking 12-hour shifts alongside or within heavy machinery in a grueling, thankless, servile state, exploited by the handful of nobles tasked with just existing for the bureaucracy to run on the planet. But, if you haven't had enough yet, as a cherry on top, you have a healthy dose of citywide gang warfare that turns streets into charnel houses on a semi-daily basis. I feel it is understandable how the mere wrath of God may end up lacking in its ability to terrify you as a common Imperial citizen when it has to compete to such an extent with the simple living conditions. It is further undermined by the fact that a human will always try to get rid of fear, as it is among the most oppressive things one can inflict on him. In the search of relief from the stranglehold of day-to-day, a good citizen may be easily swayed to heresy. In the end, fear remains an ever-present constant, a necessity, you could argue, that the Imperium and its enemies navigate to retain their control. Once, in the distant past, mankind had access to a sublime, handcrafted tool through which to utilize fear in the face of the 8th Legion of Space Marines, the Night Lords. originating from the vilest dark pits of Terra, and later on Nostramo, the most insidious world dominated by human life, though you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone that would refer to what dwelt upon that planet, choking in permanent midnight, as human. They were bands of murderers, sadists, beings that could be charitably described as demons made flesh before reaching their teens. Selected specifically for these very proclivities, they were given the power of actual demons, then trained, harnessed, and mastered the ability to break apart any being, both physically and mentally, through acts so repugnant that even I dread mentioning them. Such was their proficiency and infamy when it came to the use of fear, that entire star systems stricken with rebellion would instantly fold and redouble to be the exemplars of obedience at the mere mention that the Eighth would come pay them a visit. While the few that did not do so, well, let's just say that their example helped the Night Lords' campaigns to be the least bloody ones from across all of the legions. Unfortunately, due to mismanagement, this tool ceased to be at mankind's service, instead having mankind be left at its mercy. Thus, in its modern day, the Imperium is left with two relatively inefficient tools when it comes to the wielding of fear to keep the masses quiescent. Those being mere police forces that equal the previously mentioned gangs in brutality, and the agents of the Officio Assassinorum. I see that look on you. Yes, the Arbites being a limited blunt instrument that is not able to properly bludgeon everyone in line to the extent of the Eighth, but the infamous assassins? How can I call them inefficient with how terrifying they are, especially when it was one of them that finally brought down the progenitor of the Midnight Clad, is what went through your thoughts, wasn't it? I don't deny that they are scary, capable of razing your neighborhood to the ground, stealing your or your loved ones' lives, or eradicating your very soul. Truly horrific. But the fact remains, unless you're someone truly important and noteworthy, you are extremely unlikely to become their target, which, when combined with the additional fact that almost no one knows of their existence to begin with, makes them a rather poor tool to use directly on the masses. Now, if you are indeed someone important, dangerous, or even just bothersome to the powers of the Imperium, I'd not go to sleep if I were you. However, be realistic. Statistically speaking, if you were to end up within the galaxy of 40K as a citizen of the Imperium, my condolences for which, your story is doubtful to be special. Or, well, maybe not in the way one would categorize as special. Not making sense? In that case, here, have a read. I'm sure you'll find the contents of this tome to be insightful.
A single thump, locked away in a cage of flesh and bone, heralded the awakening. It had not been the first time Daskos' mind was dismissed when his training necessitated it, but this was different. From the split moment in which his consciousness retook control, it began to analyze its situation, making a mental checklist of any anomalies, beginning from the most mundane to the least. First among the things he detected was a mask of synthetic material clasped onto his face, which had tubing forced down his throat and nasal cavity. Whilst it impeded his ability to speak, said tubing seemingly allowed him to breathe relatively normally. This detail would have hinted to him that he was in the custody of a friendly power, were it not for the next one to claim the fore of his thoughts. He was completely immobilized. Practically all forms of restrainment were known to him, ranging from the purely physical to the hypno-indoctrinated. The only true exceptions were the ones of a psychic nature, as they held no power over his kind. Thus they were discarded as a consideration. At the conclusion of his analysis, the only explanation he could reach was that his appendages had been dismembered, as no sensation from them was reported to his brain, while the rest of him was held stiff. Paralysis was also ruled out, thanks to his still unimpeded ability to breathe and move his eyes as he pleased. though that did him no good, since his neck or head could not call upon the strength of their musculature whatsoever, leaving his gaze to wander some bottomless abyss of pure darkness, unable to measure it even with his exhalations, as the mask robbed them all. Strangest of all, however, had to be the subsequent mix of sensations that he allowed himself to notice. Using what little sense of direction and equilibrium were available to him, Daskos was able to determine that his body, or whatever was left of it, was in an upright posture that was slightly leaned back. But that made no sense, as he could not feel any harnesses on his flesh or any table or wall pressed against his back. Beyond the lack of limbs and inability to move his head, his form felt perfectly normal. Confusion involuntarily settled in the recesses of his consciousness, paving the way for other emotions he believed impossible for him to feel to creep in as well, as he tried to make sense of who had captured him and what had happened with his mission. The mission! The assassin bellowed in his mind. One particular feeling began to assert its dominance amongst the others, alongside Darkos's thoughts trying to recall as many past events as possible, and his tongue struggling to reach the fail-safe tooth in his mouth from underneath the tube pressed over it. In that instance, his concentration will be broken by a pair of unexpected intruders, sinister laughter, followed by a demeaning voice.
Excellent, excellent, Daskos. I knew you had it in you. All of those who called you monster, inhuman, and detestable mutant have been proven wrong by your very hand. And as a reward for proving that it can flow through you just like any other mortal, let me save your efforts. The vial of LTP-3 and its activation mechanism were removed a while ago. So don't waste your time looking for it.
Utterly shocked, the pariah's thoughts were left blank, unable to determine which revelation was more staggering. The apparently detailed knowledge his captor had of him, or the impossible fact that the voice did not ring in his ears, but was instead manifested directly into his mind. Who are you? How did you know all of this about me? Where am I? For the first time in its life, the Calexis screamed mentally at the other party, without the use of his animus speculum. Another shock to his system would momentarily claim Daskos' perception, this time born of his own reaction. Even if mentally and under such circumstances, no such outbursts had ever manifested in him before. He had become such a master of his emotions that he was compared to a mere sharpened piece of metal even among the ranks of his temple's agents, and even in a myriad of other cases where death had him in its clutches. Why had the repressed passion of his being decided to surface now of all times? This train of thought would not entertain him for long, as moments later the voice returned in a snarky fashion.
No, no, no! Don't become so boring. If I knew this was how you'd end up, I wouldn't have had your lips loosen so much.
With a deep inhale, Daskos steeled himself and refused to speak further, focusing his mind solely on the disgust and annoyance that washed over him. Somehow he could feel with certainty that this captor of his had smirked smugly after his last words, a slight which the assassin would not dignify with a response.
The cold blade turned into a cold shoulder.
The captor snorted before continuing.
I will admit you are due some credit for not breaking down, even when under the influence of my special concoction that allowed you to be more expressive for a moment.
Nothing of value, the man briefly thought as he maintained his silence. A sudden wave of annoyance that was not his own washed over him, along with the sensation of rolling eyes and moving limbs, just as his jailer sighed and continued.
Fine. It is only fair that we get to know each other better. The how and the where are irrelevant at this point. As for who I am someone who became quite interested in your temple after learning of it. That which is unknown and unseen always commands the greatest fear, the words by which your breed live. It is so amusing.
Another foreign sensation of glee wormed its way into Daskos's mind.
Its duplicity just cracks me up. Because at a glance it is obviously false. No one truly knows a small boy destined to rot away and die in the pits of a hive, unseen among the teeming mass of drones that share the same fate, and no one fears him. But he feared them all, because he could see them. He had to see them, and know them. Know who he could snatch another meal from, and who to avoid at all costs. No manner of imaginary terrors could match the horror those he saw on the streets and gutters evoked in him every day. Even less so than the monster he was locked in his hablock with. His father.
Confusion swelled in the assassin, both from not understanding the point of this story and from the unnatural amusement being replaced by a quiet rage. Still, he elected to not interrupt, intending on finding out as much as possible in order to come up with an escape plan. A sentiment that the unknown figure apparently ignored as it continued its rambling.
A brutal failure of a man, never succeeding in elevating his station, choosing to take his misery out on his struggling family. The mother who's tried to bear the brunt of it and protect her son as much as she could. But alas, she was smaller, frailer, even more so after he had beaten her into a miscarriage. "I won't have another deadweight mouth to feed," he screamed before turning his attention to the boy and nearly beating him to death once again.
Whatever chemicals were flowing in his system made Daskos's head spin, just not physically. Not only unfamiliar emotions, but now vivid images, sounds, and smells manifested, painting an almost lifelike vidcap of what his captor described.
Why did that state of not even living have to continue? It's the Emperor's will that we toil here, so he can reward us after we pass. The mother would try soothing him. Not a very good life, especially in the face of unbearable fear. But that is the thing about humans. They don't like feeling fear, and do their best to get rid of it. So if it continues for too long and is not utilized properly, it's bound to backfire. One day, after the father had finished beating the boy after returning home and set his sights on the mother, something would change in the little one. He decided that he didn't want to be afraid anymore. Over time, he had learned how to take the abuse without suffering too much physically, while pretending to be incapacitated, and from his lethal brushes with the ocean of scum outside their home, he had become rather quick. In the middle of the violence he inflicted upon his spouse, the father would barely be able to notice his son get up, grab the kitchen knife, and leap on his back, striking the blade over and over and over and over into his jugular, until he finally collapsed and had the knife pierce his brain through his right eye.
The presumed hallucinations experienced by the assassin momentarily faded from the sensation of an invisible finger touching his face right under the referenced organ.
"It's okay. He can't hurt us anymore. I will protect us," the boy, drenched in the bastard's vitae, said to his mother, receiving no response. He did not know it at the time, but at that moment she became the first one to give him something truly delightful. a gaze of pure fear. And things would indeed begin to improve for them, as the son never really let that knife go. They didn't know they were presumed dead, as no one came to check on them. The ruffians that did, on the other hand, slowly began to dwindle in number, while fresh meat became common on the dinner table. It was flowing smoothly until they came.
In a sudden disorienting twist, the quiet home changed to spires on fire, corpses being splayed on walls, rivers of blood and viscera flowing through the streets, and a cacophony of screams suffocating the air.
The ruling autocrats being literally thrown from their ivory towers to splatter on the floors where the lower wretches lived. The most vicious and dangerous, crying for their mothers like innocent babes. Ah, justice truly is beautiful. The boy and his mother run through the streets, avoiding being trampled by the mobs of scared sheep. Unfortunately for them, splitting from the flock caught the interest of one of them. Eventually, he cornered them in an alley, bloody red eyes clad in midnight, looming over the two. Everything had happened so fast. Never before had the boy felt such strong fear in his very bones. It only intensified as the monster slowly began to walk forward. Somehow, the young man found some resolve within himself. Squeezing the knife, he was able to turn and do his best to protect his mother. Before he could, however, the woman practically threw him forward at the thing and cried out, "Please, take him and spare me! Emperor, preserve me!"
What felt like liquid fury filled Daskos's veins, forcing a muffled and involuntary cry out of him.
The monster did indeed stop, but not because of the plea. It must have been because it saw the snap happen, as the sun froze still for a few moments. Then, in a single motion, with a wrathful cry, spun and shoved the knife into his mother's throat, up into her skull. This final betrayal had made him decide that he would refuse to feel fear ever again. Letting the flesh bag slide off of his blade and onto the ground, he would turn to the monster and scream at it, "Have at me then! I'll kill you! I'll kill you and the false emperor and anyone else that dares to use my life as a tool!"
While arriving suddenly, the outburst of rage that sank its claws into the assassin began to fade, leaving him short on breath. The sensation of a phantom finger tapping on something over a hip that did not feel like his own stood out among the transition. His now scrambled psyche began to fill with dread as the thing that had claimed him's next words made the puzzle pieces click into place.
Who am I? I am a man of my word, not a puppet for some haughty sorcerer to toy with. Do not worry about your mission. You accomplished it beautifully. He never saw you coming. But me? No, I saw you. I saw what a magnificent specimen you are. You never saw me, because I actually strained to be quicker than normal, in order to secure such a valuable asset. That old man, Bile, he does phenomenal work, and actual 1,000-sun bodies are a rare treat for his table, and more than sufficient payment for his services.
Whatever claim to stoicism once existed in Daskos was washed away through the myriad of interconnected pathways within his new prison, leaving the man struggling to struggle in the cage of his own flesh, howling a silent scream as his jailer read him his sentence. finally introduced himself.
I saw you. I know you better than anyone in this galaxy, and I can see the fear churning within you. How does it feel? Is it not disgusting? What more pathetic thing can grip your soul? Even the knowledge that with your help, countless slaves of the Golden Throne will be at my mercy is probably not as bad. Who am I? I am Viol Harrisonex, dear Daskos. And I have always wanted a little brother. We will accomplish great things together. You watch my back, I'll watch yours. And I am certain that eventually we can become the best of friends.